Hi, so I'm Hal. Welcome back to my channel. In this video I just wanted to kind of go through what I've read in the past year in 2024, kind of go a bit through my reading stats, talk about how my reading has changed a little bit throughout the course of the year, some of my favourite books, some of my least favourite books, and kind of things that I'm excited to read this year as well. This is the second time that I've had to try and film this video, so we're going through it. I will be on my phone for a lot of this because I do a lot of my book tracking via Storygraph. I like how that works, and it gives me a lot of stats and things like that, and I think it has also impacted kind of how I do read, which I will be talking about a little bit later. So in total in 2024 I did end up reading 85 books. That breaks down to about 22,000 pages and 387 hours. A criminal. Most of the books that I do read tend to be kind of medium-paced books that are between kind of 300 to 500 pages or 8 to 16 hours of audiobooks. I do tend to read both an audiobook and a ebook or a physical book at the same time. And with that I think I ended up reading like 5 non-fiction books last year. So the rest of those have all been fiction. In terms of my top genres, they're, I think, pretty self-explanatory if you've ever seen anything that I do read. It was fantasy followed by LGBTQIA, young adult, historical, science fiction, like romance, which I think is pretty standard for what I tend to read. Obviously these are often genres that kind of a book can have more than one, so a lot of things that I tend to read are kind of fantasy and historical or fancy and queer and things like that. In terms of how I read my books, I did get the majority of them via Libby, either as an audiobook or as an ebook. Followed by that, it's books that I've got physical copies from the library, books that I own, books from BorrowBox, which is another library service, and the rest of those are all other books that I think I just managed to get online in various places. In terms of how I read my books, I think I'm pretty equal with my categories, but it was digital was 36%, audio was 33%, and print was 31%. So about kind of a third of my books are kind of in each of those categories. In terms of my most read authors, obviously the top one for this past year is in fact Miss Natasha Pulley. I read The Mars House by her, kind of nearer, I think about April, and then I went through and I read her entire back catalogue, which means that I've read 7 books by her, and then followed by that it's Trudy Canavan and Christelle Dabos, both of whom I read a full book series from this past year, and then after that we have Anne Leckie and Jeff Vandermeer and Freya Marks, who I both read. All 3 of those I read 3 books from. And overall, I did have a star rating of 3.59 for this past year, and that's mainly between a 2 and a 5 star. I luckily did not have any 1 stars this past year. I do think that I have a pretty good grasp on kind of what I enjoy reading and what I don't enjoy reading, so I tend to kind of pick things that I do enjoy kind of overall. In terms of my reading, like I mentioned, I basically started off last year. I think in January I read like 4 books, and by the time I got to December I had read like 9 books that month. And basically with that, in terms of my reading journey, I read a huge amount when I was a child. I think in like year 7, one of our English teachers got us to track what books we'd read that year, and I had to keep up like adding paper to my tracker, and I read something like 156 books that year. And obviously I don't think that's feasible for me anymore, but with kind of university and work, I had gotten out of the habit of reading, and so when I started getting books from Libby, which I think was kind of midway through university, I found that was really useful. I found getting into audiobooks was really useful as well, because I am a big podcast listener anyway, and so I started picking stuff up there, and that gave me a tangible kind of time I needed to read it by, which meant that I was hitting that goal of reading that book in about kind of 20 days, which is really good to get me reading a bit more consistently, but as you can imagine, if every book that I read takes about 20 days, I'm reading only a couple of books in a month. Basically, this in 2024 I did start using Storygraph to kind of track my reading and things like that. And as part of that, they do have a tracker where you can track how many pages or how many minutes of an audiobook you've listened to in a day, and it gives you a graph. And this made me worse in a very real way, because I suddenly had that information available to me, and especially at the time, I was still making my way through A Clash of Kings Part 2, the audiobook, so I was listening to a significant amount of audio every day, and I'd be reading like 10-20 pages. And it really kind of gave me something to work for and gave me a goal that I had to hit every day, and because I wanted to read kind of more pages. I've now gotten to a point where I feel like I have a pretty good number that I'm striving to achieve every day and I'm able to hit consistently. So I tend to listen to about 60 to 70 minutes of an audiobook every day, and similarly I'm aiming for about 65 pages of whatever book I'm reading as well. That's something that I find that is doable. I am quite a quick reader, so I can bash out those 65 pages in a good like half an hour reading session, but like I need to actually put that time aside to read for however long it's going to take me to get there. And with that, it means that I'm getting through books a lot more quickly. If I'm reading a 300 page book, 360 page book, that's going to take me about a week. Obviously, it does take me a little bit longer to get through longer audiobooks, but I'm okay with that. I'm actually thinking about changing a little bit how I do my audiobook reading, because this past year I noticed that between trying to keep on top of how much of an audiobook I wanted to read and listening to my podcasts as well, I didn't really have enough time to listen to music that I liked. So that's definitely something I'm considering kind of going forward in the future. But yeah, that's the secret as to how I read this many books. It's, I'm built different and I love having a consistent goal to work towards even. And I find that that means that I read every single day and I read enough every single day to get through things quite quickly. Obviously sometimes that goes out the window. I read something really good and I finish it in a day or whatever, but that's kind of what I tend to stick by. In terms of kind of my favourite books of the year, I did end up rating, I believe, 10 books, 5 stars, and 34 books, 4 stars. There's some really good gems in my 4-star reads, but because of what I want to discuss, I'm just going to go, I think, through my top kind of 5 books of the year, and then do my top 5 kind of least favourite books of the year as well. In terms of kind of my absolute favourite books, from this past year, I think there's definitely going to be a little bit of theme. So one of my absolute favourites this past year was The Mars House by Natasha Pulley. I've talked about this book before, I absolutely love this book. This I read I actually read this in June. This was the first Natasha Pulley book that I ever picked up, just based on seeing it spoken about a little bit, and then I read the synopsis and went, this is absolutely up my street. So this is a kind of queer sci-fi book. We're following our main character, January Sterling. He is the main kind of ballet dancer for the London Opera House in a future, like, climate crisis London. And basically, in the first chapter of this book, London floods. It is completely underwater, and January has kind of 2 options. He can either try and seek refuge in a country where they're not underwater and having, that part of the climate disaster happening to them, or he can go to the human colony on Mars, Tharsis, and he ends up choosing to go to Mars. He's got nothing really else going on Earth. And when we get to Mars, what's going on there is that the people who first colonized Mars have basically gone through this naturalization process to make them kind of more adapted to Mars gravity. It makes them much taller, but it also makes them a little bit weaker. So people who are coming from Earth who have not had this and are now kind of stronger but working in a weaker gravity become very powerful, and so to kind of prevent injury and death, everyone from Earth either has to go through this naturalization process, which is various surgeries, they become a full citizen, or they have to wear what's called a resistance cage, so that they feel that the Earth's gravity kind of acting on them, and they are not given those same kind of full citizenship rights as the people who have naturalized. The naturalization process is kind of long, it's painful, it leaves people disabled, or it leaves at least people with a degree of chronic pain. And January's a dancer, he doesn't want to go through that process. And basically the plot really picks up when there's an election kind of coming up on Mars, and one of the senators, Aubrey Gale, is running on a all Earth Strong Must Naturalize kind of platform. They end up having an interaction with January, and the result of that is a political marriage, kind of made for reality TV political marriage, is organised to try and boost kind of Aubrey Gale's ratings, and get January Sterling out of the shitty living situation that he's in. And things kind of really pick up from there. There's a crisis that they then have to solve, they have to work together. Is there more things going on than what seems? This was really fun. I love stupid sci-fi bullshit. This book had little footnotes and things. I love a little footnoted book. And it was just really fun. I do really enjoy kind of arranged marriages, and people having to work within that system and kind of real feelings being felt and things like that. This was a really fun kind of slow burn. Some wild things happened in the course of this book, but overall I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed what kind of the topics Natasha Pulley was trying to explore in this book, in terms of our future, climate crisis, and also an exploration a little bit into kind of gender and gender-based violence through this kind of allegory. I had a great time. It was good enough to make me go back through like Natasha Pulley's entire catalogue, and I found some other absolute gems. So I would really recommend, as well as The Mars House. I really enjoyed The Half-Life of Valerie Kay, which is based in the 1960s in the Soviet Union, based in a city called City 40. Our main character, Valery Kochanov, has previously been in the Gulag for a reason that we will find out during the course of this book, but he gets saved to work in City 40 as a radiobiologist, which is what he was originally trained in, and along with Shankov, who is the kind of head KGB agent in the area, they start to investigate because things aren't quite right there. They're very different, I think, ends of the spectrum of what Natasha Pulley writes. The Mars House is a bit more of a political, fun space romp, whereas The Half-Life of Valerie Kay is very much suspenseful, kind of mystery. Something isn't right in this city, looking a lot more into, the nuclear history that happened in the world. City 40 is a real place, and some of the things that are described in the book are real things that happened, and it's really interesting, and I do think it's cool the kind of range that Natasha Pulley is able to write, while still keeping a certain things kind of common throughout her work. So I would really recommend, especially if you want to read books with like older gay characters. Like in all of her books, these are like men in their 30s, and they're often not about like discovering your queerness for the first time. So if you want fun romps with gays that like kiss vaguely, I would recommend. The next book that I think I want to talk about going down is The Sunshine Court by Nora Sakavic. If you saw my everything that I bought in 2024 kind of video, you will know that I'm a big All for the Game fan, enough to drop a significant amount of money on some special editions that came out last year. In terms of the initial All for the Game series, which is the Foxhole Court, The Raven King, and The King's Men, those came out in, I believe, 2013, 2014. So it's been, a decade. She hadn't really published anything else, and then came back kind of all of a sudden basically explaining that she has been writing kind of new stories in that world, following one of our other kind of side characters for the first series, Jean Moreau. Basically explained how in every other draft of those books, he did not make it through. He ended up dying. And what does it mean for him to have survived in this draft, and how does he kind of want to live again? So The Sunshine Court is that first book that explores that. So obviously from that explanation, it's pretty heavy in some parts. Jean Moreau is basically kidnapped to save him from a weird sports cult. Don't worry about it. And we spend that first book just, it recounts some of the events in The King's Men, but it also continues his story as he joins the USC Trojans and moves to Southern California. In terms of for the game series, these are gay sports romances that follow the made-up sport of Xe, which is kind of a cross between like hockey and but in a glass arena situation, like a squash or a paddle, and it's mixed gender, and people are insane about it. What else do you want from, as is normal with a sports book? In the first series, we follow Neil Johnson, who is hiding a lot of his history as he joins Southern Carolina Foxes, the Palmetto State Foxes, if you will, and kind of things evolve from there. So yeah, the Century Club's very different because I do think it doesn't have quite exactly a plot, especially to this first book, which works for what this book really is, which is an exploration of Jean trying to unpack some of his trauma, and everyone else in California reacting to that as going, what do you mean? What do you mean that happened to you? But I thought that this was great. It was so fun to be back in this world and to see these characters that, we basically only seen in passing. Also, as a big Jeremy Jean fan from 2016 when I first read these books, insane that it's actually happening. What do you mean? So it was great. 10 out of 10 no notes. This was made for me personally. The next book that I want to talk about was All the Hidden Paths by Foz Meadows. This is a sequel to A Stranger's Stubborn Endurance, which came out, I believe, in 2023, and then All the Hidden Paths was released at the start of 2024. I actually bought the physical copy of this book. That's how excited I was to read this. This is a gay fantasy romance book. We follow our two main characters, Velosin or Vel, and Sethnari or Say, who basically, at the beginning of this book, Velosin, who is the third son of a lord who has recently married and gained land via his wife and has a new heir with that wife who is going to inherit that land. He arranges a political marriage for Velosin with the neighbouring kingdom so that he can set up better trade relations kind of near where he lives, which is on the border kind of with this other kingdom. And the only problem with that whole situation is the fact that Velosin is gay and that no one knows about it because we're not living in a very progressive country. However, the country on the other side of that border, the one that he's getting arranged politically marriage to, they're a lot better about things. So when this information comes out in quite a traumatic way, it's all fine. He's gonna marry the brother of the woman he was gonna originally marry. Don't worry about it. And then he gets there and he's, starting to, interact with people, trying to, work out the culture, trying to get along with his new kind of husband-to-be. And people start trying to kill him and make it seem like it was Sethnari trying to do it. So they have to team up and investigate and try and work out what's going on. Velosin is doing a lot of political intrigue. And yeah, so that's kind of the first book. They grow together as a couple, but there's also political and fantasy bullshit going on. And the second book kind of picks up where we've left off. In terms of that relationship, we're not completely resolved, and obviously there's a lot of issues still going on from the beginning of that first book to the end of that first book that these characters have to deal with. We also move into a different city in this new country, and so it's a lot of meeting new people, doing more political intrigue and things like that. I read this book over the course of a day. It was my day off and my roommates kept walking past my room and I would just be further and further along in this book, so it was really good. I really enjoyed it. I do think that there are some parts that are a little bit weaker than maybe the first book, and I would also give a warning for there being various sex scenes in this book and some, content warnings at the beginning as well. There were a couple of scenes with some other characters, not our main two, that were a little bit put me off. One of them, which then he turned out to be a decent guy, and I was just okay, you could have done this a little bit better. But I do think it was really fun for what it was. I had a great time, and I loved kind of the vibe of this book, which is a lot of like, you have to continue coming out for the rest of your life. So yeah, I am excited to read whatever Foz Meadow puts out next. I really enjoyed a couple of things off their backlist as well. The next book that I wanted to talk about was A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland. This was a really fun book that I picked up this year because I realised that the author is this is kind of the traditional published work of a AO3 author that I really enjoyed. I don't believe any of it is like adapted from their fanfiction, but rather kind of set in a completely different world. It doesn't line up to what I've seen on their account in that kind of way. So in this book we are following our main character Cadeau, who is the younger brother to the Sultan and is very much kind of despair, especially because his sister, the Sultan, has just recently had a child. And in the beginning of this book, things kind of go all wrong for him. He doesn't really like his sister's consort. His men and the consort's men get in a little bit of an altercation, and some deaths occur. And he now is basically has a babysitter, a new head of his guard who's going to babysit him, and that's Evermere, who is very like no-nonsense, straight-laced kind of about it. And he's tasked with investigating a break-in that happened recently in one of the shipyards, and also there's been some ongoing forged currency kind of situations going on, and so we follow them as they do investigate into kind of what's going on, and Evermere and Cadeau get closer over the course of that investigation. This was really fun. This was like so engaging. There were so many bits that I was just sitting there like giggling, kicking my feet. I had such a good time, and I think these characters were so kind of real and well written and so fun. It's got one of my favourite things, which is long rants about something that I personally don't have any interest in until it's explained to me really interestingly. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, tell me more about the devaluation of currency. I would love to hear about that. And that kind of ties into, there's an ability in this world to, you are able to read the like metal content in objects. Certain people are allowed to kind of do this by taste, which is where that title kind of comes from. I'm really excited to check out more work by Alexandra Rowland. I had a great time with this. And then the last book that I would want to talk about is A Restless Truth by Freya Marks. This is the second book in the Last Binding trilogy, which in the first one we follow two characters, Robin and Edwin. Though these books are like historical fantasy romance, they are set in kind of Edwardian time, but there's magic going on. And in the first book, Robin, kind of our main character, gets a new job in the government, and he basically ends up being the liaison between non-magical and magical England. Most of the people who get this job are like non-magical children from magical families, so he's not one of those, so he's been thrust into this entirely new world. So a magician, Edwin, gets kind of assigned to him to look after him, and they also start to investigate what happened with Robin's predecessor, who got mysteriously kidnapped, and the story kind of goes from there. In this second book, we're following Robin's sister Maud, who was sent on like a Titanic-style cruise ship over to America to bring back this old woman, except on the journey home, she gets murdered on a boat, and she has to work out who killed her. She ends up teaming up with Violet, who's kind of a disgraced lady who ran away to America to join a magical burlesque show, who is coming back to kind of investigate what's going on, and solve this murder mystery whilst they're on a boat. So there's a limited number of kind of suspects. And then the third book follows a couple of characters that we're introduced to in this book as well. I really enjoyed this. I will say I do feel like it's the strongest book out of the three. The first book I do have some kind of serious problems with. The third book I really enjoyed but felt like it fumbled the ending, whereas this one was just really fun and I had a great time with it. I think the fact that we're in a limited area, we're just interacting with the same kind of cast of characters to make it that fun kind of meta mystery. I really like the relationship that develops here. There were just other really fun bits. There's a section where they have a bunch of like Edwardian erotica that they're like reading around and reading aloud and kind of tearing apart, but also like it's kind of good sometimes, which I just thought was like really fun. And I had a great time with it. Again, like with Audition Pass, this one also has some sex scenes in it as well, but nothing specifically, I would say, in kind of the content ones or anything like that. So I think that's a brief overview of kind of everything that I really enjoyed. There are other standouts that I read this year, I would say. In terms of other sci-fi kind of books that I really enjoyed, I really liked A Half-Built Garden by Ruthanna Emrys. I read The Imperial Rack, so Artillery Justice, and that kind of series by Ann Leckie that I really liked. Obviously read the rest of kind of Natasha's Pulley's book, and I didn't rate anything under 4 stars. I read Hellbent and The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo, which I both really enjoyed and had a great time with. I read A Dance with Dragons and Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin, which I also loved, as well as The Annihilation and the Southern Breed trilogy as well. That were all really fun that I wanted to kind of point out specifically. There's other books as well that I read that I enjoyed, so in terms of things that I did not enjoy that I ended up rating 2 stars, I think a lot of these books, I would say, their main cardinal sin was that they were really boring. So I would say that's true for Shadow Stitch by Carrie Thomas and The Temptation of Magic by Megan Scott. There's nothing specifically wrong with either of these books. I just didn't enjoy them that much. I felt with Shadow Stitch, which is the sequel to Threadneedle, so this is an urban kind of YA fantasy where our main character Anna, who grew up kind of in a society where she wasn't allowed to use any of her magic. The idea was that she was going to bind her magic away when she kind of, turned 18. She's now having to live with the kind of consequences of that first book. She's made a group of friends and a coven of witches at school, and things are getting a little bit more serious because there is a growing wave of paranoia around magic and witches in particular. I feel like they also did some things really well, so there was definitely that sense of kind of growing paranoia. But this book felt very long and that not a huge amount of things happened in it. I also got really frustrated with some of the characters, especially, there's been some characters that, aren't my favourite, which is, I don't mind an unlikable kind of character, but I did feel like, especially with this character who I don't really like, she just kind of got to the end of the book and there seemed to be some growth kind of going on, and then that all got wiped away, almost to kind of reset where, she's at, where, Anna and her relationship are at the end of the book, going into the final book in this series, and I found that really frustrating, and overall it was just a bit of a slog to get through. So I ended up giving it 2 stars. I do talk about it in a bit more detail in another one of my videos. And then similarly with The Temptation of Magic, this is a kind of fantasy romance book. I will say, for kudos to it, it is very much set, it's very British, it's very English. We're set in like kind of a Brighton-y type university town in the south of England by the sea, and our main character Nicole is kind of doing a between sixth form and university degree in like a local community college into kind of art history. She's also something called an Imperial, which is like a fae type, they can basically shapeshift into the enemy of things that they need to hunt situation. And in her family, they are kind of the only kind of group of these people that have not joined part of kind of a bigger organisation to hunt down the supernatural, because, of things in her past, including her mother and things like that. And basically, she starts this new kind of course. The woman that she's been desperate to kind of look at some of the whole paintings gets murdered. She starts to investigate it. That organisation also send one of their Imperial hunters to kind of investigate it as well. Kyan and Megan get closer over the course of this book. As you would expect, things start to get revealed about the history of, this people and things like that. This was fine. Again, I did really enjoy the fact that this was so kind of quintessentially English, Kyne's home base is in Liverpool. Obsessed with that. I grew up in the Northwest. Yeah, absolutely. Tell me more about Liverpool. But at the end of the day, ultimately, this wasn't great for me. I did not have a great time with it. It was just kind of okay. Similarly, I think in a similar kind of vein was So This Is Ever After by F.T. Lukens. I had seen a couple of books by him, and they kind of looked interesting. You know, they're gay kind of fantasy romances, I would say, for the most part. I was like, yeah, I'll check one of these out from my library. It was fine. I mean, it was very predictable. It was, in this one specifically, we're following a group of adventurers who have taken down an evil king, and one of them has become the new king, except there's a curse that he has to find kind of his true love and get married before his 18th birthday, otherwise he'll disappear. And this book is him kind of trying to date the other people in the adventuring party, when in reality he has a long-standing crush on kind of the magician in the group. And unbeknownst to him, the magician also has a crush back on him. And it's just, you know, that for 80% of this book, and then they get together and everything's fine. It was cute, but there wasn't anything that stood out. I wasn't fully invested in any of these characters. It was okay. I think before I get to the last book, which is definitely my least liked book kind of this year, I just wanted to mention quickly about Sunbringer, which is the sequel to Godkiller by Hannah Kana. I read the first book last year, I believe, and I thought it was okay. I enjoyed kind of the setup for this world and things like that. So in that book, we're following Kissin, who is a god killer. Her family were killed by kind of religious zealots, and the family god that they always prayed to kind of did nothing to help them, so she's on this kind of revenge quest to kind of take down every god. She is joined by Inara, who is a young girl who has the god of white lies, Skedi, who is usually a little bunny with horns and wings. She's trying to investigate what happened to kind of her family all being killed. And then the third member of this party is Elagast, who was previously a knight to the king, but following kind of the big war that happened, has now become a baker and is going back on kind of one last quest. The first book I thought was fine. I did have some issues with kind of how these characters were set up. I think the main thing that was really present in that first book was that you have a knight and a king relationship. And that's so easy to do. And you can just throw in a little sprinkling of homoeroticism on that relationship. And it's great, it's delicious, I eat it up every single time. Except this was so aggressively platonic. I don't know how to explain it. I'm someone who one time with a friend came up with a crack ship for two characters who'd never interacted in canon, but could have if things had played out differently. And I went there and went, there's nothing here for me. So you know that there was nothing, because I can work with crumbs. There were no crumbs. And it's not like there aren't gay characters in this world. Kiseth is explicitly bisexual in this book and has friends who are lesbians in love together. And that's fine. You can have a platonic knight and king relationship. Except in the second book, the author's trying to retcon and be no, there was something there, and I'm no, you can't do this to me. I did not sit through that previous book and end up going, wow, you fumbled this relationship, only for you to go no, there is something here. I'm gonna take that as an insult. Unfortunately, just with the way that I am, I'm gonna be annoyed by that. And yeah, I think in both of these books what I've realised is that the plot is interesting, the world building is really interesting. I did have a little bit of a struggle with the time between these two books. I could not remember at what point we were at in the story, but I had a good time with kind of that part. I think that she struggles with writing compelling relationships between these characters. I do not come away from these books thinking, yeah, I totally believe that these characters care for each other and want to look after each other. The only people that I do think that about are Inara and Skedi, which I do think is an important relationship in this book, but I have a genuine issue with that. So whilst I did give it 3 stars, because I think overall I did like it, I'm not the biggest fan of these books, as you can probably get from my tone. And then the last book that I want to talk about, which was I think my least favorite book that I read, was City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I was really excited for this. This sounded entirely up my alley. I'd never read anything by this author before, but I know that he's quite well loved for his sci-fi books as well. This sounds like it should be interesting to me. It's a fantasy kind of world. We have, you know, weird god things going on. Like, there's a possible revolution brewing. I really struggled with reading this book. I mean, it did not help. In this book's favour, it did not help that I read the first like 5-10% and then I had to return this book to Libby, and then I got it back like a month later and I'd completely forgotten, but I did not go back and read that first part. But part of that was because it was such a slog to get through that first part that I did not want to do it again, and that's how I felt for the rest of this book. There would be times where the writing would be like interesting and there would be interesting ideas about what was going on. But I could not tell you what this book was about other than specific scenes that I remember happening, which were interesting. There was not a plot line that I was easily able to follow throughout this book. I kept on forgetting who these people were. They did not stand out to me in that way. I struggled my way through this book and went, well, I'm not going to pick up anything else in this series, which is really sad because I thought that this book would have been cool and like interesting to me. There were things in there that I do enjoy. I love fantasy. I love religious, you know, anything that plays with religion and does an interesting thing with it. Especially when the gods are kind of real people that you interact with kind of thing. I think like talking about revolutions is always interesting and things like that. This just like was not for me. I really could not get through this. I would say that's a brief overview of what I read. I'd say that most things ended up in that 3 to 4 star range. I like a lot of things, but they're just kind of like, yeah, okay. But yeah, in terms of kind of, I know there's a lot of things that I've read that have other books in that series coming out this year that I'm probably going to pick up via my library or things like that, but things that I'm like actively excited for, anticipating, things that I've actually pre-ordered or will be buying as soon as they come out. We've got 4 books. In terms of things that I have physically already pre-ordered and will be reading, I ended up pre-ordering Catabasis by R.F. Kuang, which I'm really excited about. And then I'm also really excited to pick up The Hymn of Dionysus by Natasha Pulley. That's her new book coming out. All that I really needed to know was that it was a new book by Natasha Pulley. I was going to pick it up regardless. And then the other books would be the second and the third book in the new All for the Game trilogy. The second book, which does have the title of The Golden Raven and is tentatively going to come out on the 22nd of February, I believe. Do I know anything about what's going to happen in this book? No. The author self-publishes these for like $2 on like Amazon and Kobo. I'm going to be picking it up and I'm going to be reading it immediately. Thank you very much. Anyway, I think that was everything that I wanted to talk about. Like I mentioned, I do tend to use Storygraph for kind of my tracking. I do also have a Goodreads where I cross-post all of my ratings to as well. But you will find me here, yapping and giving my reviews about these books, because I find that easier than writing things. And that's kind of it. I hope that you're having a lovely day and that you're reading lots of nice books. Goodbye.